that's my inspirational message for the day. All right. So now we're going to talk about the Middle East. It's a big topic. We're going to talk about basically a century of America's role in the Middle East, starting in the period right after World War I, up to, more or less what's going on today. I think it's important because in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and I know many of you maybe even weren't born, or you were just like really little, 1 or 2 years old when it happened. There was this great kind of national shock. It was shocking. The imagery is amazing. It's stunning. It's terrifying. But the message was always like, why did that happen? Why do these people hate us? What created that, right? And, you don't justify that. It's unjustifiable. It's an act of terror, obviously. But at the same time, if you ignore that and you just say, well, they had no reason to do it, or they did it because they're so jealous of how good we are, then you do that at your own peril, because you don't really address the problem. You don't really address the situation. And those conditions don't really change. And so situations like that can reoccur. And they have been, quite frankly, for the last, since then. There has not been peace and stability in the Middle East, or really peace and stability globally. And the implications of 9/11 don't just affect the Middle East. They're felt here in the United States as well. We talked a little bit about things like the Patriot Act and this kind of new, kind of invasive surveillance state, the repression of certain groups like Muslims and Arabs, after 9/11. And then it's had a huge economic impact, a massive economic impact in the United States, the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and then the kind of surveillance state at home, the Department of Homeland Security, TSA at the airport, all that kind of stuff. The cost of taking care of vets who were injured in all of these wars abroad has been immense, and a lot of America's economic issues, which existed before COVID. There were all kinds of economic red flags visible for a few years now. And a lot of that can be connected to the costs of what came to be known as the global war on terror, Afghanistan and Iraq, and activities elsewhere, and taking care of wounded soldiers at VA hospitals, and the cost of surveillance and things like that. So it's kind of a big deal. All right. So I put up an outline, and I'm going to go through the first part probably fairly quickly. There's a lot of stuff on this, and I'm not going to go into great detail. Kind of part of my, the idea here is that I'm going to put this up there so that it's there and that it's important. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, then you know where to look and what's important and what's not. So the first part I probably will go through more quickly, and then after we hit like the post-World War II period, the creation of Israel, and then, kind of the Mossadegh coup and all that kind of stuff, a little bit more detail. And we've already talked about a little bit of this stuff already. All right. So here's the outline, and it's, the road to 9/11 and Iraq, the U.S. and the Middle East. And let's start, we always start with maps. This is the area we're talking about. And this, is in the news every day, right? Where Iraq is. There's a big war there. Iran, the United States and Iran have been in escalating conflict now for the last few years. The United States had an agreement with Iran that Iran would not build nuclear weapons, and then Trump removed the United States from that agreement. And so there's always been this turmoil regarding Iran, Syria, where there has been all kinds of civil conflict with various countries involved for several years now. The United States is involved in that. Saudi Arabia, one of America's allies. The United States sends a great deal of military equipment and aid to Saudi Arabia. It's a country with a very repressive internal system, and that's been in the news. Egypt, which had sort of a revolution and a rebellion, the so-called Arab Spring of 2011. And then maybe most importantly, this small country here, Israel. And we'll talk about that as well. All right. And I mean, even other areas, I'm not going to talk about this, but Turkey has been a really turbulent area with a lot of implications for the United States. So it kind of in Pakistan over here, if you want to go further out, right? So you could do a lot with it. I just want to explain that's the area we're talking about when we talk about the Middle East. All right. When we talk about the Middle East, there's a lot to talk about, but the key themes are always going to be oil, Middle Eastern oil, Israel, America's support of the state of Israel, and then Arab nationalism. And those are going to become more important in the latter period. All right. Again, this small map here is a map of the Middle East, but it's a map of the Ottoman Empire. And remember when I talked about World War I, the origins of the Great War, I said, well, it kind of gets started in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire. And I said, we'll talk about that in the last class. Well, here we are. The areas that are today's Middle East were part of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire fell apart, just blew up. And remember, that was kind of one of the big prologues to the Great War. Those areas now were not part of the Ottoman Empire anymore. And so other countries came in to try to take control of them. But they were lost to the Ottoman Empire, and this map will show you when, all right? So when we're talking about the states in today's Middle East, the countries in today's Middle East, they all kind of emerged out of what was once the Ottoman Empire. And when so the implications of the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Ottoman Empire, are huge. It helped create the conditions that led to the Great War, especially in the Balkans. And then it also kind of released these Middle Eastern areas to in their mind, become independent. But in reality, Western imperialists came in and took control of them, which created, problems that are still ongoing. All right. So I want to start by talking a little bit about an area on the map here called Palestine. Now, this is a very old map. If you saw that map today, we'd probably say Israel. But historically, that area was called Palestine. And in 1914, the year that World War I, the Great War, began, the population of Palestine was approximately 60,000 Arabs and 25,000 Jewish people. All right. Palestine historically had been an area where Arabs had come to settle. And those numbers, that ratio, is going to be pretty steady for a while. All right. However, historically, there had always been this attraction to Palestine by Jewish people. And so, and that's going to become obviously a bigger and bigger issue as the century goes on. And I'll get it in a second. So the Great War began in 1914, and immediately the countries in Europe focused their attention on the old Ottoman Empire, those areas of the old Ottoman Empire. The British had a plan, and I'm not going to go into much detail on any of this stuff. If you're interested, it's easy to look up, right? The British had a plan which was described in this series of letters called the Hussein MacMahon correspondence. And all this meant was that basically the British told the Arab world that they would get land out of the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of details and things, but that's the important part. So the British had said to the Arabs, don't worry, you're going to get something out of the Ottoman Empire. You'll get your own land out of that, right? Now, around the same time, though, there was a meeting between all the European states where they came to something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And in there, you can see here by the colors, they decided they were going to carve up the Middle East. So when the empire fell apart, when the Ottoman Empire fell apart, these countries thought, okay, we're going to be independent now. And we've talked about, like, what happened in Vietnam, right, in 1945 and then again in 1954. They thought they were independent, but in fact, other countries came in, or Korea at the end of World War II thought it was independent, and then it's carved up into two different places, right, north and south, right? So this is not unusual. Countries, smaller countries think they have independence now because an empire has broken apart or a war has ended. But in reality, these bigger states swoop in and say, no, we want to take control of that. So you have these different, the Europeans are already in 1915 and 16, the Hussein MacMahon and Sykes-Picot are trying to carve up what they call spheres of influence, areas where they'll have control, all right? And in fact, it becomes, at the end of World War I, the Great War, that becomes official. The League of Nations, which the United States did not join, actually carved up the Middle East. Now, one of the key issues at this time emerges, and it's going to be, and it still is a key issue there, is what to do about Palestine, and especially with regard to Jews all over the world. There was an ideology that had become important and more popular in the 19th century and really grew in the early 20th century called Zionism. Zionism came out of there were Jews all over Europe, in various European countries, in Russia and Poland and France and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all over. So you have this group, this ethnic religious group, not American, globally, Jews, but they don't have a land of their own. If you know anything about politics today, a group like the Kurds would kind of be like that. So there are these Kurdish groups in Syria and Turkey and Iraq and all over, but there's no Kurdish land per se, right? So the idea behind Zionism is that Jews all over the world should have a homeland, and that homeland should be here in Palestine, because that's what the Bible said. So it's basically based on these cultural and biblical claims. The Bible said that Jews were from this area, and so all Jews all over the world should have this homeland in this area here, Palestine or Israel, right? And during the Great War, the British, Lord Balfour, their foreign minister, even issued this statement, the Balfour Proclamation, which is going to become pretty important. It's going to kind of become the basis for what happens after that. And Balfour said, His Majesty's government, Britain, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, right? And will use their best endeavors to facilitate this. It's understood that nothing shall be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities, Arabs, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. So this is important. It's basically, it's a proclamation. It's not a law. It's just a statement of your ideas, of your sentiments, of your goals. And it says, Britain favors the establishment of a national home for Jews in Palestine, but it won't violate the civil and religious rights of other people in Palestine who are not Jewish. And we'll see how that plays out. It doesn't work out that way, right? When the war ended, then you had the disposition of these ex-Ottoman states. So you had what were called mandates established. A mandate gives a European country control over one of these areas, and it has an occupying government there, right? So you had like Lebanon was taken over by the French. Syria was taken over by the French. Iraq was taken over by the British. Transjordan was taken over by the British. And Palestine, which is the crucial one here, was taken over by the British. So Palestine was a British mandate after the Great War. Okay, so the issue of Israel is already, kind of emerging. It's not going to become that critical yet, but with World War II, it obviously will, right? So Israel's already established now as something that's a big matter, a big deal in Middle Eastern relationships with the rest of the world. The U.S. is not terribly involved in this yet. The United States, remember, during the Great War, was establishing itself as a great power. The U.S. will become more involved as the century goes on, especially with World War II. All right, so Israel's already kind of emerging. Now, oil becomes a big deal too around this period. In the period around World War I and after that, the 1920s, you started to see really major discoveries of oil throughout the Middle East. And the biggest oil company in the area was owned by the Turks, the Ottomans, right? The Turkish Petroleum Company. But everybody else wanted to get in. The British wanted to get in, the French wanted to get in, the Italians wanted to get in, the Russians wanted to get in, and of course the Americans wanted to get in, right? This is the era, right, when Rockefeller has emerged as the biggest, oil producer in the world, really. And so all of these countries want to get into that area and get concessions. Concessions are rights to land where oil is, right? So you get, you want those kinds of concessions. You want control over particular areas in that region. And so, all of these countries are contending with each other. And so in 1928, they all got together and they had a big meeting. And they talked about oil resources and what was the Ottoman Empire. And at the end of it, they came to an agreement, which was called the Red Line Agreement, right? And that red line is around basically kind of a lot of the old Ottoman Empire. They agreed, well, first of all, the Turkish Petroleum Company didn't want anybody else in there, right? the Americans, the British, the French. Now the Americans said, hey, that violates the whole open door, which we've mentioned many, many times before. So they decided to kind of divide it up, give different countries, different concessions in different areas. But then that red line was supposed to be an area where nobody from outside, none of the Europeans or the Americans came in. That didn't last long. There was just too much oil, especially at the time. Then they discovered the biggest oil producer was Saudi Arabia. There was just too much oil for this arrangement to stick. And by the early 1930s, just a few years after the Red Line Agreement, you started to see countries try to make deals on their own with the Saudis. And there was just too much money to be made out there to stick to this agreement. So you start to see all of these Western companies now getting more and more involved in the Middle East because of oil, because of petroleum. And that's a big deal. And it's going to be a big deal and a bigger deal as the century goes on and obviously into the 21st century as well. With World War II, oil became really important. It was important for, the war effort itself, for supplies, for shipping, for production, industrial production, just, in the US all over, really just increased so dramatically. So oil became more and more important. And the United States had a particularly strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, which was the biggest oil producer. So the US was in pretty good shape as a result of this agreement with Saudi Arabia, but other countries were interested in it as well. And, remember, I think I briefly mentioned that there was a showdown in Iran in 1946, right after World War II ended, Persia, which is now Iran. The Russians left occupation troops in the north, and the U.S. forced them out. And Iran, was one of the biggest oil producers, along with Saudi and Iraq. So already you can see that there's, the possibility, the potential for conflict over oil is already great, in World War II. Now, one of the biggest developments, one of the biggest factors in World War II, obviously, is going to be the Holocaust. We mentioned Hitler's ideology blamed Jewish people for all of these problems in Germany. It has all these stereotypes, Jewish bankers, and, it was just this really ugly racism. And as a result of that, you had the Holocaust in Germany, where the German government and governments associated with the Nazis, they took over the Italians, and, there were Holocaust, there were concentration camps all over Europe, would start rounding up Jewish people. And not just Jewish people, they rounded up gypsies, and they rounded up disabled people, and people who they call communists and socialists, and homosexuals. So the Holocaust is huge. But the biggest group individually were Jewish people, and about 6 million were rounded up and then, killed. So that was, obviously an immense and horrific humanitarian catastrophe. And it gave impetus to the idea that Jews should have a safe space, a homeland, because they had been all over, in Russia, in Germany, in Poland, all over the place. And the idea grew that, okay, there should be a homeland so that they can, have their own area. And that obviously would be Israel, based on these old Zionist ideas, based on the idea that there had been Jews before, that there are, these kind of biblical claims to it. So more and more Jews began to move in to Palestine, right? I got a bunch of maps here, and I'm going to, use those to some extent because it's sometimes easier just to look at it. So this is 1947. This is just right after World War II ended, and you have land ownership, right? Now, so you can see that this area is still heavily Arab. Jewish lands are darker, and this kind of lighter orange or brown or whatever it is were Palestinian lands, right? So the area was still, over 80% Arab, and the population was still about 80% Arab, right? But more Jews started to move in. And so the United Nations, which was established after World War II, tried to develop a partition plan, a way to make this area a homeland for both Jews and the Palestinians who were already there. So they came up with this, which created roughly a 50-50 split between the two, even though the population was still heavily Arab, right? Now, that would lead to a war. Jewish settlers began to come in and forcibly remove Palestinians. And so you had these Jewish kind of paramilitary groups. The best known were Haganah, which would later become the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and then groups like the Stern Gang and Irgun, who were often referred to as terrorist groups, which were led by people who would later become like the prime ministers of Israel, began attacking and forcing out Palestinians from their homelands, from their villages. And in fact, they attacked the British too. Remember at the beginning, I said Britain had a mandate from the League of Nations over Israel. So Britain was actually in control. They were actually in charge of Palestine, of Israel. But the Jewish groups like Haganah, Stern Gang, and Irgun began to attack the British too, and in fact blew up the King David Hotel. There was a massive attack on the King David Hotel, which is where the British administrators were living, were staying. That's where their headquarters were. And well over 100 people were killed. And so the British left. You know, it worked, right? They drove them out. Now, at that point, then the removal of Palestinians got even more rapid, became bigger. And Palestinians were soon removed from Palestine in huge numbers, right? These are some maps of Palestinian refugees. So they were forced out. They went to places like Lebanon and Jordan. This is it's basically the same map. These are villages which were depopulated, villages where Palestinians had lived but had been removed. And Arabs refer to this as the Nakba. Nakba means like cataclysm or catastrophe. After the Holocaust, and then you have this removal of Palestinians. The United Nations in 1948 voted to create a new country, a new state, Israel. All right. So Israel is now a country which is essentially a Jewish state. So the removal, the depopulation picked up even more rapidly, and so this is the depopulation of 1948, where settlements were, the people removed, they were sent elsewhere, and the villages were just destroyed, right? The numbers, I've seen different numbers, but somewhere probably around maybe 750,000, maybe 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were removed from Palestine, from their areas. That was about half of Palestine's pre-war population. So about half of the population from 1940 had been removed and sent abroad. They became refugees, and there's still Palestinian refugees all over the Middle East. They were sent abroad. They were expelled from their homes. About 400 to 600 Palestinian villages were basically destroyed, razed during the war. Palestine was kind of gone, even though the population had been 80% Arab. This war, really kind of just removed massive numbers of Palestinians. Probably, I anywhere from 600. I've seen 600,000. I've seen 1 million. So it's a huge number, and destroyed massive numbers of villages. And about 80% of Palestinians ultimately, as this played out well into like 1948, 1949, about 80% of Palestinians left their homelands or had their homes destroyed, right? And so this is the Nakba, and it's something that Arabs still remember, still talk about, all right? These are various maps, and we can go back to these later, but these are maps of Palestinian loss of land. This is 1946, which was about, like I said, at least 80-20, probably more than that, Arab, Palestinian. This was the UN plan, which was more like 50-50. And the other part of that, this is the point, is Israel gets access to the water, and there's not much water there, so that's important as well. And then later on, we'll talk about 1967 and thereafter, all right? So you have an increasing crisis in that region. Other Arab states defended the Palestinians, right? The United States recognized Israel. Now, that wasn't today. The United States and Israel are intimately connected. They're close as, and huge levels of aid go to Israel. that wasn't that clear cut. In the period after World War II, actually, a lot of Americans were reluctant to support Israel that strongly because they were afraid that that would alienate, that would get the Arab states angry, and that they would use oil as political leverage. They would say, hey, since you're supporting Israel so strongly, since you're dispossessing the Palestinians, we're not going to make, we're not going to make our oil available to you. All right. So it's a difficult issue, but the United States was seen fairly early on as being part of the pro-Israel group and part of the group of Westerners. So you already have, the French are there, the British are there. There are some Italian groups involved, more like in places like Libya and North Africa than in the Middle East. But the United States is now identified as a problem, as kind of a Western empire, much like the British and the French were. And so early on, you started to see the US becoming less popular in the region, and more people throughout the Middle East seeing the United States as a problem, as an enemy. It's a strong ally of Israel. It's an enemy of the American states. Now, this document, I think, is really intriguing, and you can click on it. It's a PDF, but I just, pulled out the first page, and too small probably for me to read, but I'll summarize it for you. What's striking about it is the title is called Anti-Americanism Resurging in the Arab World. So that means that more and more people are becoming anti-American, and resurging means it's coming back, right? So it's already been there. So this isn't something that's brand new. Now the date on this, and this is from the Secretary of State in the United States, the highest diplomatic official, right, in the State Department. He sends it out to consulates and embassies throughout the region, every country, and in another country there's consulates and embassies. So there's in Houston even there's consulates, and then embassies are all in Washington D.C. So the Secretary of State sent this out to all these officials, these American officials in the Middle East, resurging anti-Americanism. The date on it is May 1st, 1950. So we're talking 1950. So in the aftermath of 9/11, a lot of people are going to say, like, why do they hate us? Why? What happened? Why would that happen, right? 50 years before that, you have this recognition that the United States is seen as a problem, if not a rival, if not an enemy throughout the Middle East. And, if you can read, I don't know, you can maybe make some of this out, but anti-Americanism in the Arab world, it's resurging in the Arab world. Bombings, so already there have been bombings taking place at legations in Beirut and Damascus, Lebanon and Syria. Public statements by Syria's political leaders in Iraq also. So this is happening in the entire region, right? Diatribes in Syria, Egypt, and Iraq all testify to the re-enkindling of Arab animosity against the United States. So that's kind of a big deal in 1950. Why is that happening? Whether prompted by communists or Muslim extremists. There you go, right? Communist and Muslim extremists. We already talked about that. It's kind of your go-to thing. What's striking, though, or whether encouraged by, or attributable, this is kind of surprising, or whether attributable to a sincere objection to America's part in Palestine developments. So even the U.S. recognizes that in that region, the United States is seen as Israel's ally, and that Palestine, didn't get fair treatment, and the United States is part of that. But it says the current emotionalism, and this is another one of the stereotypes in the Arab world. They're emotional. They're not reasonable and logical. They're kind of emotional. The current emotionalism bodes no good for the interests of the United States. All right, that's kind of a big deal, like I said, because that's in 1950. So already in 1950, the United States is well aware that it is seen as a problem throughout that region. And it is seen as Israel's ally, and it is seen as an enemy of Arab states. And it is also seen as part of this kind of Western imperial grouping with the British, with the French. So, in the so-called Arab Street, that's a word that became more prevalent more recently, but the Arab Street is like just what people think about the United States. Now, the Arab governments in the US are fine, because a lot of these Arab governments are old monarchies, which are kind of falling apart anyway. And so they've made deals with the US for oil rights and things like that. But below that, not the leadership, but the people in the Arab world are starting to become more and more anti-American. If you talk to people in 2020, they're going to invoke this stuff. They're aware of it, right? Whereas in the United States, not really so much. So that's the period And I did go through that fairly quickly. Now I think it becomes more timely. And with regard to why 9/11 finally happened, I think it becomes more direct, right? So I'm going to spend a little more time on some of this stuff, although some of it is stuff we've already talked about. One of the biggest episodes, and when I talked about this, several classes ago, I said, if you were going to go around and say, name some of the major developments in the 20th century, a lot of them would be obvious, right? The Great War, the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, McCarthyism, World War II, Vietnam, whatever, the communism, the fall of the Soviet Union, But very few people would probably mention the coup in Iran in 1953, which I did talk about, right? The British, were worried because Mohammad Mossadegh, and I showed you his picture, was trying to nationalize oil. And the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was getting like 99% of the profit out of Iranian oil. And so they had a coup and they overthrew him. Now, this is just, again, if you're really intrigued by this stuff, this is a big set of documents which goes into all kinds of detail about the way it was done. All right. In 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown and a new government led by the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, was put into power in Tehran. And the Shah ran a very repressive government. Arabs didn't forget this, right? They saw this as, a clear case of the United States and the British, dominating that region. These imperial countries, the Americans and the British, coming in and overthrowing a popularly elected, Mossadegh was elected government because he was trying to gain control of the oil for the Iranian people, right? So in the Middle East, that in the United States, nobody knows really about the Mossadegh. It wasn't really until the hostage crisis in the 70s that people kind of started to learn a little bit about what had happened in 1953. But in the Arab world, it's a big deal. And so the coup, the 1953 coup in Iran, and Mossadegh are really important in the context of 20th century history because that kind of creates a model, not just for Iran or not just for the Middle East, but for all of the third world, that area that's not so developed, because that's going to happen again and again and again. We've already talked about that, right? Then a few years later, the situation becomes even more difficult for the United States because of the rise of pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism. And I mentioned at the very top, nationalism. And that's often associated in particular with this guy here, Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Nasser was a colonel in the Egyptian army who led a coup in 1953 to overthrow this old dictator, this old king who had really kind of doddering and had been on good terms with the United States. Nasser believed in that the entire region should work together, should work collectively to modernize. Modernization was a big word in the 1950s. Modernization meant industrialization, electricity, better irrigation systems, right? And he believed that countries shouldn't even just do that on their own, that the region should get together because they were under, the control of these European imperialists, the British, the French, the Americans, and that they should get together. And pan means across. So across the Arab world, pan-Arabism. So Nasser is immediately kind of seen as a problem in the Middle East by the Americans, the British, the French, and so on, right? So this idea of pan-Arabism is emerging, and I'm just going to mention this briefly because it's going to be important later. It reached many countries throughout the Arab world. I mean, Nasser, people who kind of believed in Nasserism, who had the same ideas as him, staged coups and took over governments or began rebelling against the governments all over the Middle East. And in Iraq, it became a real, it became successful. In 1958, actually, I don't need to do that yet. In 1958, a general named Adal Karim Qasim led a coup that overthrew the old-aged king of Iraq, who had been on good terms with the United States. Karim Qasim, like Nasser, was a nationalist. He believed in pan-Arabism, and he believed that Iraq should control its own resources. Mossadegh, Nasser, Karim Qasim, there are a bunch of them. And that's the key here, that these people believe that they should control their own resources. And what's that resource? It's oil, right? So this this is not, to the British, to the French, to the Americans, this is not tolerable. That oil can't be, just kind of taken over by these countries. When he was vice president, Dick Cheney said something along the lines of, it's not our fault that God didn't put oil only under the ground of democratic societies, right? So he's kind of blunt about it, right? So now you have this idea of pan-Arabism, of Arab nationalism, posing itself as a threat to America's oil interests in that region. And it became a crisis not long after that in 1956. And it had to do with an area called the Suez Canal. Now, this is a big, I think it's a I forget which branch of the U.S. government. This is the history of the Suez Canal crisis, if you're interested. But, all right, so the Suez Canal, right here is the canal zone. It goes from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. It's vital for shipping oil and for military movements as well. Think of the Panama Canal between the United States and Latin America, right? So the canal, even though it was in Egypt, was owned by the British and the French. It's the Franco-Anglo or Anglo-Franco Canal Company, right? In 1955, the crisis occurs in 1956. A year before that, Nasser had been promised help from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United States. He wanted to build a dam to create electricity throughout Egypt. It was called the Aswan High Dam Project. And the United States agreed because even though they didn't like what Nasser was doing, they wanted to try to stay on good terms with the Arab world, because remember that document, Resurging Arab Anti-Americanism in the Arab World. So the United States agreed, but Nasser also was neutral. So he was also talking with and conducting trade with and purchasing weapons from Eastern Europe. And so in 1956, the United States found out that Nasser had purchased weapons from Czechoslovakia, which was a communist country in Eastern Europe. And so the U.S. pulled out all those offers of aid for Aswan. And Nasser was furious. He said, "May you choke on your fury." And what he did was he blockaded the Suez Canal. He got a bunch of old ships and just scuttled them so nothing could get through. The British and French were furious. Israel was furious. And in October of 1956, they took action. They actually attacked Suez. It began with Israeli troop movements and air attacks in the blue here, and then British and French and Israeli paratroopers attacked. So there was a military attack on Suez in 1956, which had the potential of creating a regional crisis, it is a regional crisis, but a regional war. And guess who stepped in to end it? The United States did. All right, now that probably would not have been your guess, right? The Americans don't really like Nasser. They're pissed off at him because he bought weapons from Czechoslovakia, and they don't like this whole concept of Arab nationalism. But the Americans also understood that if they took sides with the British and the French, the entire region was possibly going to blow up. And that would not be good, because if you have the entire region erupting in wars against the British, against the French, against the Americans, against people in those governments who were, on good terms or loyal or faithful to the Americans, the British, or the French, then you'd have a regional war. And that nobody wanted that. That wouldn't be good for anybody. You wouldn't have access to oil. You'd have this big conflict throughout the entire region. The U.S. role in the entire third world would be diminished, and that would be great for the Soviet Union, right? Everybody would say, "Oh, look what the Americans are doing. The Soviet Union's not doing this," right? So the U.S. stepped in, went to the United Nations, and actually had, background talks and forced them to call off the attacks, right? So Nasser had, he succeeded. He had taken control. He took control of the Suez Canal, right? Now, the Americans weren't happy about that. They didn't like him. And after the Suez Crisis, even though they stopped the British and the French and the Israelis from destroying or causing a much bigger conflict, the U.S. took actions against Nasser in terms of aid and things like that. So the U.S. was never on good terms. They certainly weren't happy, and they you know, in 1958, they helped overthrow government in Lebanon, and then the coup in Iraq. What was interesting about the coup, that thing I clicked on, was that the U.S. didn't like Karim Qassim, and you know, in the aftermath of Suez, I mean, Arab nationalism became even more dangerous. So when Karim Qassim took over in Iraq, a group of Iraqi militias began to oppose him, and they were supported by the United States. And in 1963, Karim Qassim was overthrown by this group. Now, the lead group, the lead part of that group, the lead political party in that group was called the Ba'ath Party, B-A''ATH, right? You may have seen that. And in 1963, the Ba'ath Party took over. They overthrew Karim Qassim, and then they purged people who were in Karim Qassim's group and his political party and his army. And the United States sent CIA agents to Baghdad to work with the Ba'ath Party and these other people to identify Karim Qassim's, you know, close people and kill them. And part of the winning group, part of that group with the Ba'ath Party that won, supported by the United States and the CIA, was a younger official named Saddam Hussein. So Saddam was on, you know, the Americans were on the same side as Saddam when they overthrew Karim Qassim, all right? So the United States, you know, overthrew government in Lebanon, in Iraq. It continued to aid Israel. It continued to do everything it could in that region. And, you know, it supported the Shah in Iran. It supported the government in Saudi Arabia. And so it did everything it could in that region to maintain relationships with you know, governments there, and to try to stop you know, the momentum of Arab nationalism, right? Because of the importance of oil. And in fact, in 1960, not the United States, but the Arab states actually understood how important oil was. And this actually was a move to try to kind of, you know, a preventative move in a way to not let the Americans and the British and the French take over. They actually created a group called OPEC, which I'm sure you've heard of, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So originally it was 16 countries. I think it's 13 now. And this is just a recent map from 2018 to show you, you know, so the United States actually individually is the biggest oil producer, but OPEC collectively is obviously much bigger, right? So you can see this in 2018, you have, you know, 1.2 almost, what is that, billion, right? Versus 308. So it's over three times more, right? 4 times more almost. So what OPEC did was, that was kind of an Arab response to what the United States was doing. And that's going to be especially difficult in 1973 and 1979. It also led to action in Palestine, where the Arab states had been supporting the Palestinians who had been removed from Israel. So there are, you know, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now in various areas that aren't Palestine, in Jordan and Lebanon and elsewhere. And so in 1964, a group called the Arab League got together and helped create an organization that would come to be known as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And again, in an earlier generation, that person would be very recognizable. One of the more famous people in the world throughout the 70s and 80s into the 90s, Yasser Arafat. Now, he was the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO was established as a kind of political unit for the Palestinian people. It denied that Israel had a right to that land. It continued to argue that that was Palestinian land. The goal there was the liberation of Palestine. It believed that Israel was illegally occupying that area genuinely and historically and legally belonged to the Palestinians. It was dedicated to restoring the Palestinian homeland, and it would do so through armed struggle. It believed that it would have to do so militarily. They believed at the core that Zionists had not been legitimately entitled to this land, but had taken it and then established and then dispossessed, you know, huge numbers of people during Nakba and after. And it demanded that all of these Palestinians be brought back to their original homeland, to their original places. Remember when we were talking about the title movement in New Mexico and elsewhere, where it's tierrina? It's kind of the same thing, right? That this land, you were dispossessed from land that once belonged to you and you want it back. So that's kind of the point that goes on. And so for a long time, the PLO's tactic was going to be armed struggle. It finally, later in 1993, had an agreement, a place called Oslo, which I'll mention briefly, where they recognized Israel and they gave up, the idea that it would be armed struggle, right? But the situation is pretty tense, and this is going to lead to two pretty big and important wars within a short period of time in 1967 and 1963. So in 1967, you had something called the Six-Day War, and these are just different maps of it, right? Relations between Israel and the Arab states just kept getting worse. And, after the establishment of the PLO, even worse again. In fact, in 1956, let's see if it's on here. In 1956, Israel and Egypt almost went to war over this area here. It's called the Straits of Tiran. This is Egypt. The Sinai Peninsula is Egypt. And Nasser threatened to close this off to Israeli shipping. Remember, this is when the Suez Crisis is taking place. So this is one of his movements against Israel, because Israel is attacking, Suez, So, so this had already been, there's been a great deal of tension between Egypt and Israel really since 1948, right? There have been skirmishes and all kinds of stuff going on for a long time before that. And this is Israel before June of 1967. So this is Israel here, right? By 1967, the tensions became really, really dangerous. Israel continued to be worried that Nasser was going to close off the Straits of Tirana, which would prevent Israel ships from getting access to it. Nasser finally said, I'm going to close it off to Israel in 1956 in May. So just right after that, in June 5th, Israel attacked Egypt. It, took preemptive action. It began the war because it didn't want Nasser to close access off right here, the Straits of Tiran, or right there. And so they believed there would be an imminent attack. So Egypt wasn't expecting war. It wasn't prepared for it. The Israeli attack was overwhelming. They attacked Egyptian airfields and, just kind of destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. It just kind of wiped out. So the Israelis moved into the Sinai. They also went into the Gaza Strip up here and took control of that. This is an area that's on the border, and it's next to water. Water is really important. This is a desert, so if you can get access to water, you take it. So that the Israel took control of Gaza as well. Nasser, abandoned the Sinai, and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all surrendered on June 11th. So the war lasted 6 days, hence the Six-Day War. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had about 20 million people killed, 20,000 people killed. Israel lost about 1,000. Israel took Gaza, took the Sinai, took the Gaza, and also this area up here called the Golan Heights, which is on the border of Syria and Lebanon. Well, this map actually is better. So this is, the yellow is territory before the Six-Day War. This kind of whatever that is, lighter brown, I guess, is territory that was taken right after the Six-Day War. So Israel in the Six-Day War took over Golan Heights, this area called the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Sinai. Huge victory, huge conquest of land. And across the region, then more and more Palestinians were expelled. So about another 350,000 Palestinians were removed from their homelands, from their settlements, because of these territorial conquests after the Six-Day War. So the Arab world, the Arab states were not happy about this, and they were planning something for some time, and that took place in 1973 with the Yom Kippur or Ramadan War, depending on where you are. It's one or the other, and this is just another map of it. There's, if you want to, different colors, different ways to look at them. Some are easier than others. So this began in early October of 1973 during Yom Kippur and Ramadan, right? The Arab states had been planning some kind of retaliatory action since the Six-Day War in 1967. And it was led by Egypt and Syria against Israel. It mostly took place in the Sinai and in these occupied areas of Israel, like Golan, right? In 1973, the war began this time with the Arab coalition attacking Israel on Yom Kippur, which was kind of a surprise attack, a surprise strike. And initially, Egypt and Syria entered the Sinai and started pushing the Israelis back. So in the initial phases, the Arab states were actually doing, success. They were having military success. Israel then rallied and in a matter of short time, basically repulsed the Arab states and won again. Now, one of the big factors in both 1967 and even more in 1973 was American support. After 1967, the United States began sending more and more military equipment to Israel. The United States had always been, an ally of Israel, but had tried to kind of be somewhat balanced, to not alienate, to not get the Arab states that angry because of the politics of oil. But in 1973, the United States kind of went all in. It conducted an aid operation, I think it was called something like Nickel Grass, in 1973. During that basically month of war in October of 1973, the United States sent 22,000 tons of things like tanks and artillery and ammunition and C-5 transport planes, which are just massive and immense. You can fill them up with all kinds of tanks and armor and things like that. And the United States support was really vital in making sure that Israel defeated the Arab coalition, right? So again, if you want to look at the map here, so held by Egypt after the Yom Kippur War, with this red stuff, and then brown is held by Israel. So Israel actually conquered even more area there in the Sinai. All right. Now, in both of these cases, there was an international outcry against Israel, and the United Nations actually passed two resolutions, Resolution 242 and Resolution 338, and they're right there if you want to read them. Both of them said that Israel had illegally conquered those territories and should give them back. Israel just rejected it at the UN, so those resolutions, never took effect even in 2020. Right? Israel has continued to just reject them. Right? So the Middle East is really in turmoil now. After 1973, you had the first time where OPEC took action, and in 1973, after the United States threw in and joined in with Israel, OPEC and the Arab states instituted an oil boycott. They decided they were going to not sell oil. Boycotts when you don't do something, right? So in 1973, they said, we're not going to sell oil to the United States. So this led to the first oil crisis. And I remember a few weeks ago, I showed you a picture of all those gas lines, right? So the price of oil went from $3 a barrel to almost 10 times that. So this is the leverage. This is the main weapon that these Arab states have, is oil. And so this created a huge economic problem in the United States because everything, everybody needs oil for everything. It's not just for cars, for your gas, it's industry, it's manufacturing, petroleum is part of everything. So the American economy saw massive inflation as a result of the boycott and gas rationing and things like that, right? So there's clearly a lot of stuff going on throughout that period. And, the United States is seen as, kind of on the same side as Israel. In 1977, Jimmy Carter became president. He wanted to do something about this. And this is one area Carter has still really been active in. Carter has always been active in issues of the Middle East and trying to create Middle East peace. So in 1978, he got together with the leaders of Egypt and Israel, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. And they met in Washington, outside Washington, at Camp David, which is where the presidents go to, that's where their vacation spot is. And this is, okay. So this is just, I don't know why I have that one up there. Oh, it's just the Camp David Accords. Okay, so if you're interested in the actual technical language of it, it's right there, right? So Carter met with Begin and Sadat, and they created what was called a framework for peace, and it said that they would eventually somehow create Palestinian self-government, because Palestinians were now secondary citizens. Carter often uses the word, and catches hell for it, apartheid, to describe Israel. Basically, he says that the Palestinians are in an apartheid situation, kind of like, in the American South before the Civil Rights Movement, or in South Africa. So you have a minority group, in this case, a group called, and not to be a minority group, blacks in South Africa were overwhelmingly larger than whites in South Africa, but, the whites control the government. So you have a group, in this case, Palestinians, who are being denied basic human rights. So Carter was really active and involved in this. So the Camp David Accords, so the Palestinians should get some kind of self-government. Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty, right? Because they had gone to war both in 1967 and 73. And, you needed to kind of create some kind of mechanism for peace between Israel and the other countries there. And Egypt recognized the Arab states never recognized Israel. They didn't even think Israel should exist. So Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel withdrew from the Sinai. All right. In the aftermath of that, Carter, Begin and Sadat won a Nobel Peace Prize. So it seemed like there was some movement toward peace in the Middle East, but that didn't last long either. There continued to be Israeli settlements, and we'll talk about that in a second. Israel continued to take more land, and within lands that it occupied, like the Golan Heights or the West Bank or Gaza, it continued to push more people out. And so finally, the Palestinians just kind of spontaneously erupted in what was called the Intifada, the uprising, right? The first Intifada was spontaneous. It wasn't like militarized or planned out or organized. It was just like people just had enough. So Palestinians began to attack Israeli occupation forces. In all of these areas, Israel had military troops enforcing the occupation, right? So, all of a sudden, just spontaneously started to see like Palestinian young kids throwing rocks at the Israelis, and it became increasingly intense and violent from the late 80s into the early 90s. Israel sent about 80,000 soldiers into various occupied areas, and about 1,200 Palestinians were killed in the Intifada. The Intifada led to another peace agreement, this called the Oslo Accords, this is just, again, if you're interested in the technical aspects of it, it's right there. The Oslo Accords, in the Oslo Accords, the PLO got together with Israel and in 1993, and they agreed again that they would, kind of figure out something about the West Bank and Gaza, that there would be a transitional period, and then the Palestinians would get kind of self-control. The Palestinian Authority, which is still around, but is really kind of doesn't have a whole lot of power. I mean, it's still under control of Israel. It redeployed Israeli troops, and it didn't really help the Palestinians all that much, frankly. It didn't give them self-determination. It didn't really deter Israel. So, what seemed on the surface to be maybe, potentially useful actually didn't. And in fact, what it did was lead to an increase in settlements. So you started to see post-Intifada settlements throughout the entire region. So there's even more of a depopulation. settlements were communities where Palestinian people, just average, these aren't military units or anything like that. These are just Palestinians living in these areas. And Israel started to take them over beginning after 1967, and more intensely. And they're in the West Bank, and they're in East Jerusalem, and they're in Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip, and all over. So Israel forcibly removed. They would send construction crews in, supported by the army, and they would bulldoze homes, and they would make people leave those areas. So they depopulated and destroyed entire areas to create settlements where Jewish people could go live and live now. So a lot of Jewish people are living on lands that were just destroyed and belonged to Palestinians just 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Somewhere in the vicinity of 400,000 to 500,000 Israeli settlers are now living in these areas that have been destroyed, that had been once been Palestinian land. You can kind of see here, some of the areas, that these blue areas which have been repopulated, right? In fact, just this week, Mike Pompeo, the American Secretary of State, was in the settlement in Jerusalem, right? It's the first time an American official had actually set foot in one of these. Basically, the U.S. has acknowledged that these settlements are okay. So the U.S. support of Israel is really important, and that's been kind of the issue throughout. The U.S. support of Israel is a big deal. It's been a big deal for a long time, and that's really created a great deal of animosity in the Arab world, right? And that would lead, after Oslo, to a second intifada, which started around 2000. The Oslo didn't really accomplish much. The Arab world was still, angry. The settlements had intensified; they'd grown stronger, and so in 2000, you had another uprising against the Israeli occupation forces. They used tear gas and rubber bullets and stuff like that, stuff that we saw in the streets like this summer. There were a lot of casualties, a lot of people killed. Maybe 3,000 or 4,000 Palestinians were killed. So the second intifada was finally, kind of put down as well. So the area remained in turmoil and still does. And the United States was always seen as kind of, the problem there for a lot of people in the Arab world, basically the entire Arab world, right? And this is just a little data on it. This is a foreign aid to Israel. And this, cumulatively, it's 146. It's actually $146 billion, right? So it's 146,000 million, which is billions, right? So the United States has sent at least $146 billion. Now that's just in direct legal aid. It also sends military aid, and it sends other kinds of financial, technological assistance, and things like that there. So the United States clearly has been connected to Israel, associated closely with Israel. Inside the United States, the critics of America, kind of point to two different reasons for that. One is that inside the United States, the state of Israel has significant political influence. It has groups in the United States that lobby Congress, and they're very influential. Another idea, which I think is really important and isn't talked about as much, is that Israel is really important to the United States because Israel takes care of a lot of problems in the region, so the United States didn't have to. So, if in 1980, in the 1980s, the U.S. Israel blew up a nuclear reactor in Iraq. Israel will take action against Lebanon. Israel is there. Some people call it the cop on the beat. Like, instead of the United States having its own people in the Middle East, Israel is kind of like the police force for the United States, and that's an important factor in it too. The United States sends Israel a lot of money, a lot of equipment, a lot of loans, and in turn, Israel protects American interest in the region, right? So that's kind of the United States and Israel, right? And I'll briefly mention it again, but there's some other stuff, and we're getting now into kind of the two key areas, I think, leading to 9/11. And one has to do with Afghanistan, and the other has to do with Iraq. All right. Now, remember in 1953, the United States overthrew Mossadegh and put the Shah of Iran in power. Well, in 1978 and 79, the Iranians had had enough, and they got rid of the Shah. They had a rebellion, a revolution, and got rid of it again here, if you're interested in it, right? And this revolution was really the first Islamic revolution. It was led by mujahideen who wanted to create this kind of Muslim state, and they brought back a guy who had been in exile named Ayatollah Khomeini. So now Iran is, an anti-American state. It had been America's best ally in the region, like Israel, really. So now Iran is opposed to the United States. That led to another oil shock because, again, Iran withheld oil, which created another economic crisis and great inflation. And then kind of, making things much more intense, Iran took hostages. And again, if you're interested in that, in 1979, Iranian kind of rebels, mujahideen, stormed the U.S. embassy and took the Americans there hostage. So the United States and Iran in 1979 now are on a collision path, all right? And that would lead to a big war in the Middle East between Iran and Iraq, all right? Now, this isn't really that much, it's not really covered that much, but it's really important, all right? So Iran and Iraq went to war in 1980, and again, these are is some documents here, but I'm going to keep this up just because of this picture for a minute here. The United States was on good terms with Iraq. And so there's no specific evidence, but in the Arab world, there was always speculation that the United States talked to Saddam Hussein and essentially told him that it was okay to attack Iran. Iran and Iraq had all kinds of problems going for quite some time. One was Sunni, one was Shia. There was a conflict over something called the Shatt al-Arab waterway. There were skirmishes about the border. So they didn't get along anyway. And so the United States is supporting Saddam Hussein. And this is, I just keep this up, this is a very famous picture. In 1983, Donald Rumsfeld was sent to Baghdad by Ronald Reagan, the president, to meet with Saddam, to offer his support. So that's why I said the U.S. tilts toward Iraq. So the United States was helping out Saddam Hussein in 1980. Here are a couple articles about that if you're interested, right? So in 1980, Iraq and Iran went to war. Throughout that period, the United States sent Iraq, Saddam Hussein, many billions of dollars of aid, all right? So this is just, a map of the two, right? And so they share a border. So the United States is supporting Iraq against Iran. Throughout the 80s, the United States sent maybe up to $40 billion in aid and equipment. And toward the end of the war, both sides were just wiped out, at like 1 million people killed. But toward the end of the war, Iraq finally kind of took the offensive, and it did so using chemical and biological weapons, right? It used gas, stuff that was in violation of international law. While it did so, and this is an article that the New York Times got declassified documents. I never logged in, so it doesn't matter. During those final stages of the war, as Iraq was using gas and chemical and biological weapons against the Iranians to defeat them in the war, there were American advisors in the field working with Iraqi units. So the United States helped Iraq defeat Iran in 1988. Just keep that in the back of your mind because it's going to become important later, right? So the United States and Iraq were on the same side, all right? Now, I want to shift a little bit to Afghanistan, which is an area that's much in the news and it has been for a long time. And this is Afghanistan. And it's important because it shares borders with Iran and Pakistan and the old Soviet Union. It wasn't an area that the U.S. really had much interest in throughout, really in the post-World War II era, right? It wasn't really that important. The government there was led by this guy named Daoud, who was, kind of pro-American, but, whatever. And then Iran began to fund, I'm sorry, but Daoud was kind of close to the Soviet Union, not really a communist country or anything, but he got aid and from the Soviet Union. So Iran, America's ally, began to try to get rid of the Daoud government. All right, and they sent anti-government, forces there, and they offered him aid, and so Daoud joined on with Iran and began to attack. It's somewhat complex, so again, you can put down your pen and listen to it because it's kind of a good story if you're into like spy stories and stuff like that, political, geopolitics and things like that. It's kind of a good story. So the government in Afghanistan, led by this guy named Daoud, began to wipe out the Communist Party in Afghanistan. Really hardcore repression, just bloody, killing them, right? Now, because you got to make it more complicated, there were two different groups of communists in Afghanistan. The government was going after both of them, but those two communist groups were very different. One was pretty extremist, kind of a hardcore communist group led by a guy named Hafizullah Amin. Don't worry about it. The other was more moderate, and it was led by a guy named Babrak Karmal. Don't worry about it. All right. In 1978, the Afghanistan communists joined the Air Force and they overthrew the Daoud government. And the Soviet Union had nothing to do with this coup. But in 1978, there's a new government in Afghanistan led by this pretty hardcore communist group run by Hafizullah Amin. And they were rough, all right? So Amin initially had plans to modernize the country, land reform, give women the right to vote, give girls the right to have an education, stuff like that. But he put them into place very heavy-handedly, very kind of violently. And then people turned on him. And so Amin began to repress the moderate communists the same way Daoud had. So you have these extremist communists led by Hafizullah Amin attacking, repressing, and killing these moderate communists whose party was led by Babrak Karmal. Simple, right? All right. So there's huge turmoil in Afghanistan as two communist groups are fighting against each other. Those are the two choices in Afghanistan. You have this communist government, which is really hardcore, and then you have this opposition communist group, which is more moderate, right? The Soviet Union's trying to stay out of it because they don't want to get involved in this region. They wanted the Amin government, which was communist, to chill out, to stop this repression, to stop killing people, right? But it became more complicated because amid this civil war in Afghanistan between two communist groups, young Muslims who called themselves mujahideen, again, started to come in and fight in Afghanistan. And a lot of people in the army, a lot of soldiers in the army began to mutiny and desert and join them, right? So now the Soviet Union is kind of more alarmed because Afghanistan is on the border. It's a buffer zone. And Pakistan and Iran are enemies. So the Soviet Union now says, we got to do something because this is getting out of hand. You have these crazy communists, as they refer to them, Hafizullah Amin, killing these moderate communists, Babrak Karmal. And now you have these Muslims and these army, deserters who are joining in. And it's just getting really out of hand. So the Soviet Union, still around at the time, met. At first they said, you can't do anything. We can't send troops in, right? But the Mujahideen were getting stronger. So now the problem wasn't just the crazy communist government, but it was also these Islamic Mujahideen who are getting involved, which the Soviet Union doesn't fears, right? Because those Mujahideen are on the same side as Pakistan, which is a Soviet enemy, right? That's why I said, put your pen down. Don't worry about it, right? The U.S. doesn't want to do anything militarily, but Pakistan is starting to give more support, which means weapons, to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And then, in July of 1979, Jimmy Carter, who was the president, began to send money and military equipment to the Mujahideen, who were fundamentalist Muslims. So the United States now is on the same side as the fundamentalist Muslims, the Mujahideen, who are trying to overthrow the government in Afghanistan, all right? the U.S. aid came before the crazy communist government began wiping everybody out. So the Americans got involved early during the Hafizullah Amin time as president. The U.S. wanted to get rid of that government in Afghanistan very early. This was when Jimmy Carter was president. Now, Jimmy Carter's, so the Soviet Union finally sent troops in around Christmas Day, 1979. The Soviet Union had enough. So it sent troops in against the communist government. The Soviet Union sent in troops to get rid of the communist government led by Hafizullah Amin and hopefully put into power the more moderate communist government led by Babrak Karmal. All right. Now, the United States increased its aid. Jimmy Carter's main advisor was a guy named Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Brzezinski thought that if the United States kept sending aid to these Muslim fundamentalists, then the Soviet Union would have to come in, which is what happened. And this is a brief clip of Zbigniew Brzezinski going to the Afghan-Pakistan border and talking to these mujahideen.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes, your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
All right. You know what? Let me check something here because I don't know if I had the volume on. I did. Okay, good. That's really striking. So you have this American National Security Advisor, big shot, right? With Jimmy Carter's, at Jimmy Carter's direction, going there and telling these fundamentalist Muslims that those homes, those land, those are yours, and you're going to win. You're going to get that land back because God is on your side. So the United States is on the same side as fundamentalist Muslims, all right? In Iran, those fundamentalist Muslims put Khomeini in power and took Americans hostage. In Afghanistan, those very same mujahideen, Islamic fundamentalists, were receiving millions of dollars, ultimately billions of dollars of support, surface-to-air missiles, Stinger missiles from the United States, right? So in Iran, the United States is opposed and trying to get rid of and supporting Iraq in a war against fundamentalist Muslims. In Afghanistan, the United States is supporting and giving money and weapons to these fundamentalist Muslim groups, these mujahideen. All right, make sense? Now, ultimately, what this is going to do to kind of, quick is the Soviet intervention against the Amin government worked. So Babrak Karmal did take over the moderate communists, but the American aid, and not just the United States, but Pakistan and others, continued. And so ultimately what happened in Afghanistan was that the fundamentalist Muslim groups, initially supported by the United States, took over and became the Taliban. And then some of these mujahideen in Afghanistan formed their own organization called Al-Qaeda, which included Osama bin Laden, right? So in the 1980s, then, the United States, the 70s and 80s, so on one hand, the United States is trying to get rid of Khomeini and the fundamentalist Muslims in Iran, and it supports Saddam Hussein in a war throughout the 1980s against Iran with a ton of military aid and money, and it was there when Iraq was using chemical weapons, right? So the U.S. hates fundamentalist Muslim government in Iran, supports Saddam. In Afghanistan, the United States supports the Islamic fundamentalist group against the Afghan government. They win, and they become terrorist groups opposed to the United States, all right? And this is often known as blowback. If you ever heard that term, I've used it before, right? You do something like support Saddam or support the Mujahideen, which become Al-Qaeda, and it blows back against you. And that's clearly what happened. And that would lead to the first Gulf War, and then what we often refer to as the terror era. The first Gulf War has to be seen in connection with the end of the Cold War. In 1989 and 1990, the Soviet Union and a bunch of these communist governments in Eastern Europe just fell apart pretty rapidly. So now the communists, who had always been, kind of America's justification, right? We need to spend more money on the military because of the communists, and we need to build these weapons because of the Soviet Union, and we need ICBMs because of the Soviet Union, and we need these new jet fighters because of the Soviet Union. That's gone now, right? So the US government begins, as people called it, looking for enemies. They need to find something else to use to justify continuing these big military budgets and this aggressive foreign policy. And it's hard to do because the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were big deals. Communism was a big deal. And now, without much warning, it's kind of fallen apart. I can't say, well, not really without much warning. That initial 1975 CIA report that I talked about, that's kind of what it said was going to happen. But the government didn't want to hear it, so they replaced it with Team B's report, which said, oh, the Soviet Union is going to kind of coming to get us, and we need to build more weapons. But the reality was that you could see this coming. For experts who studied the Soviet Union, they kind of could see it coming. And by that time, the Soviet Union had been fighting in Afghanistan for 10 years. It intervened in 1979, and that wiped out the Soviet Union more than like Vietnam hurt the United States. The Soviet Union just really kind of got destroyed. It sent so much money. It spent so much money in Afghanistan. It sent soldiers there. A lot of Russian kids were killed in Afghanistan, which didn't sit well at home. Then there was this replacement in government with Mikhail Gorbachev, who wanted to create this kind of new open government. So it really helped destroy the Soviet Union. So it happened pretty rapidly. And when it happened, the United States had to find enemies. And initially it says, well, we can try the war on drugs. It invaded Panama, but that wasn't big enough to really work. It eventually settled on, kind of particularly bad people, rogue states, they call them. There were particular countries that were so bad and so evil that we had to be prepared militarily because they may do horrible things. They might even have nuclear weapons, so we have to really take action against them. And the biggest rogue state, the one that became the biggest and most fearful enemy of the United States, was Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the guy who the United States just a few years earlier had been supporting, who had used chemical weapons, gas against the Iranians with American advisors in the field with him, right? The United States had sold him chemical and nuclear weapons. But the United States needed enemies now. And so in 1990 and 1991, it shifted. And that would lead to the first Gulf War. It has to find enemies. And so Saddam Hussein really kind of fit the bill. After the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq was in bad shape. Wars cost a lot of money. They're destructive. So Iraq, not surprisingly, needed to sell oil. That was, its economy was based on that. However, when the war ended in 1988, oil prices were really low. So Iraq was in trouble because it wasn't able to, make enough money to rebuild because the price of oil was low. And a couple things had happened. OPEC, which we mentioned earlier, had set certain oil prices and production quotas. That's what cartels do. You're allowed to produce this much and we're going to keep it at this price. Well, there is a small country right here below Iraq called Kuwait. Kuwait was created in 1932 by the British. This had always been Iraq. Iraq used to go down to here, but British officials literally drew a line and said, this is now Kuwait. Iraq never recognized Kuwait as an independent state, but the British did. So Kuwait had a lot of oil, major oil fields. So Kuwait was producing more oil than OPEC had told it to, right? And so the price of oil was low. And when this happened, it sounded hard to believe. It sounds like something out of a Bugs Bunny Roadrunner thing, right? there were these stories that Kuwait was doing something called slanted drilling. So they were starting in Kuwait, but they were sending drilling into Iraq. And so they were kind of stealing Iraqi oil. Turns out it was true, right? So Saddam Hussein and the Kuwaitis didn't like each other. There's a lot of animosity going on between the two. There's a lot of skirmishing. Iraq is very angry at Kuwait because the price of oil is too low. And there's increasingly talk of war. So in July of 1990, the United States ambassador to Iraq, to Baghdad, a woman named April Glaspie, met with Saddam Hussein. She went to there, let me just, it's easier to do it that way. She went to Baghdad, and it's glass P, I'm sorry, I put a B in there. After all these years, you think I know better. And she has this meeting, and she, and Tariq Aziz, who's the Iraqi foreign minister, said, our policy in OPEC opposes sudden jumps, but Saddam Hussein says $25 a barrel isn't a high. So they want the price of oil to go up. That's the point, right? It had gone to $12 a barrel, and that's a disaster, right? So Glaspie, and this is the important part, says, I think I understand this. I understand what you're saying about the price of oil. I've lived here for years. I admire your extraordinary efforts to rebuild your country. I know you need funds. We understand that. And our opinion is that you should have the opportunity to rebuild your country, but we have no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreements with Kuwait. That's really these words are really critical here. I understand that. I've lived here. We know that you need funds, right? Which means oil, because that's how you're going to get funds. We know that you need more money coming in from oil. And our opinion is that you should have the opportunity to rebuild your country, meaning you should have more oil. And we have no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait. If you're Saddam Hussein, if you're Tariq Aziz, and you're in that room with April Glaspie, and she just said, we understand that you need oil and you need to rebuild your country, and we have no opinion on your border disagreement with Kuwait. What have you just heard, right? I mean, essentially, you, in your mind, the U.S. ambassador has just said that the United States is not going to do anything if you do something against Kuwait, right? And that's, whether Glaspie wanted to bait Iraq or whether that was just some kind of honest, naive statement, who knows? But the reality is the Iraqis heard it in that particular way. And this was on the 25th of July. A week later, Iraq invaded. Oh, there, I had it already highlighted. A week later, Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. And that began what would become known as the First Gulf War. The United States at first was kind of indecisive, but it began to send troops into the region and demand that Iraqi forces leave northern Kuwait. And then they finally pushed down and took over all of Kuwait. Eventually, the United States sent about 500,000 troops into the Persian Gulf. They went to the UN. They got other countries to join in, the Russians, the Iranians, Chinese, and others. And they formed this coalition. And in January of 1991, they began to attack the Iraqi forces in Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm, right? So it was a massive attack. The United States had over 1,800 aircraft in the initial phases in January of 1991. It flew over 100,000 sorties, which is one bombing run. You drop the bomb, you come back. It dropped over 225,000 bombs. By late February, just barely a month into it, there was a land invasion. The United States sent troops in and forced all of the Iraqis out of Kuwait back into Iraq. Now, the Iraqis, who did not like Saddam Hussein, thought that the United States was going to continue all the way up to Baghdad and overthrow the government. So Iraqis began to rebel against Saddam Hussein, but the Americans didn't. They stopped. So the United States did not send troops in to go into Baghdad to stop Saddam Hussein, to overthrow Saddam Hussein. So Saddam was able to slaughter all of these uprisings, these rebel uprisings, right? and tens of thousands were slaughtered by Saddam Hussein. In the aftermath of the war, you had like really serious crises throughout the region, and this, in many ways, is where you start to really see how 911 starts to take shape. You know, it's happening in Afghanistan and in Iraq too, right? And in both of these places, the United States initially supported those groups. It supported Saddam Hussein throughout the Iran-Iraq War, and it supported the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, right? Blowback, right? So the United States then, it stopped. So Saddam Hussein remained in power. So this leads to, an entire decade before 911, which we often call the terror era. After the war, the United States increased its support toward Israel, increased its role in Saudi Arabia. The U.S. had bases in Saudi Arabia. And that was one of the things, too. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, there's a border with Saudi, which is the biggest oil-producing country in the world. So the United States also wants to protect Saudi Arabia from whatever Saddam Hussein might have on his mind, right? So the U.S., after the war, instituted sanctions against Iraq, referred to as the sanctions regime. Sanctions are, penalties. They're like the reparations against Germany at the end of World War I, at the end of the Great War, the sanctions, right? So the U.S. included economic embargoes. So no country was allowed to invest or trade in Iraq as a way to hurt Iraq. They're trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein, right? They want Saddam Hussein gone, and they want Iraq to pay reparations. They want Iraq to pay Kuwait for the damage of the war. Now, Iraq's broke. So, it's got nothing, right? They also wanted Iraq to not build, they wanted to prevent Iraq from building WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, which Saddam Hussein said, I don't have, which in retrospect was the case, right? So these sanctions imposed were the most comprehensive ever. They included medical supplies and food, which according to international law are not allowed to be part of any set of sanctions. They're not allowed on any sanctions list. They ended up like it ended up like the Iraqis after the war. First of all, the air war attacked and destroyed their water system. So Iraq didn't have clean water. Most places in Iraq did not have clean water after the 1991 Gulf War. Because of the sanctions, they could not get anti-cancer drugs. They could not get chemotherapy drugs. They could not get x-ray machines. They could not get certain medicines. Anything that the United States said that might have a military application, they could not get lead pencils because lead can be used in building bombs, right? So they could not get that. They could not get the chemicals and tools to clean the water supply. So the sanctions regime was brutal. It was huge. Human rights groups said that maybe 1 million Iraqis died between 1991 and 2000 just because of the sanctions, because there was no medicine, no x-rays, no chemotherapy drugs, not enough food, not enough clean water, right? What they did, instead of getting rid of Saddam, actually was kind of made him more secure, because instead of people being mad at him, Saddam could say, this is America's fault. So it didn't get rid of Saddam either, right? When Bill Clinton, now this is occurring when Bill Clinton is president. So Clinton was very hawkish as well. He continued to attack areas. He continued to have airstrikes against Iraq. So the sanctions regime was real. But throughout the Middle East, the U.S., didn't make any friends with this either. And terrorism also increased as a result of that. America's role in the Middle East, remember that anti-Americanism is a resurging thing. It's worse, way worse by 1990 than it had been in 1950. The United States doesn't have a lot of friends in the region. It's supporting Israel. It attacked Iraq, and it's, just in not on good terms. And so in the 1990s, you have a significant increase in terrorism. And ironically, it's most associated with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, two groups that were initially constructed in Pakistan to fight in Afghanistan and received assistance from the United States. Now, I'm not going to say the U.S. created Al-Qaeda or bin Laden. Bin Laden never, was at the time not a big shot leader in the 80s. But the United States certainly had a huge role, a vital role, in creating the groups that became al-Qaeda and included bin Laden. Had the United States not been sending all that aid into Pakistan, then things would have happened. Who knows what would have happened, right? But the U.S. clearly had a role to play. So now, by the 90s, bin Laden has emerged. Bin Laden comes from a very well-known and wealthy family in the Middle East. They had a bunch of construction companies and all kinds of other businesses, right? Now, most of his family was actually kind of secular, but he became really a fundamentalist Muslim. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, that became a real big deal for Muslims, fundamentalist Muslims all over. They were kind of excited because of what had happened in Iran, and now they wanted to go into Afghanistan and try to liberate that country as well. So young Muslims from all over the region moved in to Pakistan to fight against, the government in Afghanistan, and they became al-Qaeda, they became Taliban, right? And that led to a big increase in terrorism. Terrorism, you can attack civilians, you can attack public places, assassinate political officials. There's all kinds of elements to it, right? Pakistan, where the United States was sending aid to the Mujahideen, became kind of the breeding grounds. They would have kind of schools called madrasas, which were kind of training people to fight, to become, fight in terror, right? And one group in particular, al-Qaeda, became America's major enemy. Osama bin Laden was upset. He was a fundamentalist Muslim, and he believed that the fact that the United States had bases in Mecca and Medina and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. So the fact that the United States had bases and troops in the birthplace of Islam really angered and was a major motivating factor for bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And bin Laden hated the Saudi government because he thought the Saudi government was too close to the United States. So the Saudi government kicked him out, sent him into exile. He went to Sudan, where the United States tried to assassinate him. He was banished from Sudan. By that time, in the mid-90s, the Taliban had taken over in Afghanistan. They had defeated the Russians. So bin Laden went to Afghanistan, right? And that's where he kind of went into exile, and that became headquarters, right? Al-Qaeda had been very active already. In 1993, this picture here, Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center in New York in 1993. They put a truck bomb in Tower 1 in a parking garage. They thought they were hoping it would destroy the entire thing and take it down. It did not, but the blast killed 6 people, right? Following the World Trade Center bombings, Al-Qaeda continued its attack. It attacked an American base in Saudi Arabia called Khobar Towers, where American troops were living. It attacked American embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya. It attacked an American destroyer in Yemen, which killed a bunch of American sailors, right? So in each case, the Clinton administration in the 90s responded with attacks, right? So Al-Qaeda in the U.S. are kind of at it already. They're kind of going at it already, well before this, right? And then came 9/11. Then came 9/11, a very famous day. If any of you, these are just different.
It appears that there is more.
These are just different news reports from that day. So everybody is aware. I mean, the United States and Al-Qaeda are on each other's radar. There's no secrets here. They've been going at it for a decade already. Al-Qaeda blew up the World Trade Center. It attacked a bunch of American bases. It attacked all kinds of things like that, right? And so there's no surprise here. And on August 6, 2001, wait a minute, I think I did highlight this here. Yeah. On August 6, 2001, the United States, President George Bush got a daily briefing. Every day, the president wakes up in the morning, goes to his desk, and it's called the PDB, the President's Daily Briefing. And there are different ones about different topics, but one's about foreign policy, right? Trump doesn't read these. They sometimes tell him, and he doesn't even want to hear those, right? But this was the President's Daily Briefing. This is on August 6, 2001, right? And it was entitled, this is the title of it, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., right? That's the title. That's on the page, right? If you look at it, you can find these. It's all over the internet, right? So the title of the President's Daily Briefing is "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States." So it's not secretive. It's not cryptic. It's not hard to figure out what that means, right? And it says, media reports indicate bin Laden has wanted to conduct terrorist attacks in the U.S., right? He's implied in the U.S. television interviews that his followers would follow the example of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And then they talk about, people who they've talked to who talked about hijacking American airplanes and things like that, right? So, we have not been able to corroborate some of the more sensational threats, but somebody from whoever, an anonymous, a source said bin Laden wanted to hijack the U.S. aircraft, right? In other places, they were talking about bin Laden wanting to attack American buildings and federal buildings, like the Pentagon, right? Nevertheless, FBI information indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attacks, including recent surveillance of buildings in New York. All right? That's not difficult. That's not difficult to understand. The government did nothing. There were FBI agents reporting on very suspicious activity. There were these young people, students from Saudi Arabia who were going to flight schools, and they just wanted to learn how to fly. They didn't want to learn how to land. They even said that, we don't want to learn how to land, right? And so that led so that you have this President's Daily Briefing, which it kind of says, look, there's something going on here that was just ignored. And then 911 happened. 911 happened, right? And Americans said, what happened? Why do they hate us? And bin Laden, everybody knew it was bin Laden. And bin Laden gave 3 reasons. So this kind of they hate us because we're so good. They hate us for our freedom. No one justifies 911. It's an act of terrorism, right? But bin Laden said, the attacks occurred because the United States has bases in Saudi Arabia, because it's imposed these brutal sanctions, which may have killed 1 million people against Iraq, and because the United States is repressing the people of Palestine through its incredible support of Israel, right? You don't have to agree with any of those, but they're not, they're not like a lot of people said, oh, this is Muslims who hate Christians and it's the clash of civilizations and all that. The reality is that these are 3 political reasons. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but they're very basic political reasons. And they come out of all of these previous engagements that we've just been talking about for all this time, right? So the United States, there was a reason. Doesn't mean it's a good reason, certainly not a legitimate reason, certainly not a reason you can accept. Blowing up the World Trade Center and Pentagon and killing people is not, that's terrorism, right? But at the same time, historically, I think it's crucial to understand why people do this. And 911 emerged not just because one particularly crazed individual like bin Laden and a few crazed people who hated Christianity and hated Western decadence because they were Muslims decided they were going to blow up a bunch of stuff. That's not it at all. It emerged out of a long period, like a century of American and relations in that area, right? If you want to know more about the President's Daily Briefing, there's a lot more stuff in there about it, all right? So what did that do? Well, it led to more war. The United States invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001 and defeated the Taliban fairly quickly. It maintained pressure on Iraq. It kept telling the public that Saddam Hussein was behind 911, which was not true. There was no evidence for that. Saddam Hussein and bin Laden hated each other. It continued to say Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons and biological weapons, that they could use against the United States. All the inspectors who were in Iraq said, no, they don't. It didn't matter. In March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The United States expected the war to go very quickly. They thought, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense, said the Iraqis would be thrilled to see us there. We'll get rid of Saddam and they'll greet us as liberators. They'll throw flowers at us, kind of like the Austrians did to the Germans during the Anschluss in 1936. And initially, the Iraqis were happy. The U.S., by December of that year, Saddam was captured. So he was gone. I mean, he was overthrown early, then he was captured in December. So Saddam Hussein was gone. That was what the Iraqis wanted, but it didn't stop there. The United States stayed in Iraq. It kept troops in Iraq. And what it did there was essentially begin to meet really heavy opposition inside Iraq. There were all kinds of militias who were preparing to fight against the Americans. They wanted Saddam gone, but they also knew that the United States would probably stick around. So even though Saddam was deposed early in 2003, the war continued. These militias began to wage insurgencies, and a lot of these militias included like Muslims, fundamentalist Muslims. It included people from the Iraqi army who then joined the anti-American forces, people who were Shia who wanted to get rid of the Sunni. Saddam was a Sunni, which was a minority, but it ran the government. So you had Shia against Sunni as well. And so a big war against not just the US, but against the Iraqi population took place. Sometimes it occurred in very close settings, like literally, house-to-house combat in cities, like Fallujah is probably the best known. The insurgents, the anti-US forces used car bombs. They used IEDs, improvised explosive devices. They would make bombs out of cell phones and small electronics that were remotely detonated. And pretty soon, everybody turned against the US. Inside Iraq, they wanted the US out. Inside the United States, Americans began to oppose the war. And by 2004, even though George Bush was reelected, not by a lot, Americans thought the Iraq war was a disaster. They wanted it to end. Iraq suffered huge losses. I mean, maybe 1 million were killed during the sanctions. Maybe another 100,000 were killed just in 2003 to 2005, in that first phase of the war. The US had 4,000 soldiers killed. This is the first time since Vietnam the United States had a bunch of soldiers killed, which also helped turn Americans against the war, right? In 2007, the US had sent more troops, and they called it a surge. The fighting seemed to subside. Barack Obama ran for president saying, we're going to get out of Iraq. But that didn't really happen, right? The United States removed a lot of troops, but there were still over 100,000 private forces. There are kind of mercenaries, groups like Blackwater, I forget what it's called now, continue to stay there in Iraq. So the United States still had a presence there. Obama really escalated the use of drones, pilotless airplanes, electronic computerized airplanes, which fly and bomb particular areas. They're remote controlled. Obama used drones extensively. Obama conducted, I forget how many, over 20,000 drone strikes, killed huge numbers of people, many of them civilians. I mean, there would be like accidental bombings of, weddings where 50 or 60 people might be attacked. And so, the idea was we're going to go after Al-Qaeda, but the reality was that these drones were actually kind of indiscriminate. Bin Laden himself was finally attacked and captured in 2011, in May of 2011. But even then the war, even with that, the war in Iraq was still ongoing. The U.S. finally got all of its regular forces out in 2011, but the insurgency continued. And in 2014, a kind of a radical group, which consisted of kind of mujahideen and old veterans of the Iraqi army, formed a group called ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And that force is still going on, right? So the Middle East is still at war. You also have a major war going on in Syria, an uprising that began against the government of Bashar Assad in 2013, I think, is still going on. The United States and the Soviet Union and Russia, have had, been supporting various militias and armies there, and that's still ongoing. There was a brief, Arab Spring in 2011 where kind of you had these popular uprisings. Those have all kind of been, kind of overturned. So it's still a region with a great deal of turmoil in it. In the last few years, it's intensified. When Donald Trump became president, he ran against immigrants. That was part of his platform. So as soon as he became president, he instituted a ban on Muslims. He said that people from these countries were not allowed into the United States. He claimed it wasn't a Muslim ban, but in fact, They were all Muslim countries. It went through courts. It was finally upheld. Trump changed the capital, the American embassy site, the capital of Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's important because the Palestinians also believe that Jerusalem is their capital. So they always had the capital in Tel Aviv. And by saying the capital is going to be in Jerusalem now, it alienated and angered them even more. In the United States, Trump and a lot of politicians, most politicians from both parties, have attacked a thing called BDS. BDS stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's an attempt by activists to get the United States to not support Israel and to support the Palestinians. In the United States, the Department of State has come out against this. It's a lot of people say this is a free speech issue. Now it is, the United States is saying you should not be allowed to boycott Israel, right? And the United States, like I said the other day, is recognizing settlements to the point where Mike Pompeo, just in November of 2020, has visited Israeli settlements in West Bank and the Golan Heights, all right? There's also a massive economic cost of this. This is a study done by a program on, it's called 20 Years of War, Cost of War Research Series, that estimates that the United States, since 9/11, spent $6.4 trillion on the so-called war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, VA hospital for vets who've been disabled and so on. All right. So that's where we are. The world is still in turmoil. It's the United States is still in conflict with Iraq, with Iran. The issue of Israel is still important in that world. Saudi Arabia has a major role to play. It has a government now, which is accused of human rights violations, killing a journalist last year. So the area is still in turmoil. So that the road to 9/11 was based on this long, century really of American interaction in the Middle East. And the road since 9/11 isn't, all that different. I mean, you still have the same forces at play. You still have this role of the United States. You still have this desire for the Arab states to get the Americans out. They see the Americans as an occupying force. They believe it's a colonial system. They believe it's a colonial relationship. So it's important to know all this. It's not a lot of fun. It's not exciting, but it's really important to understand this stuff, to understand why particular historical episodes, even really bad ones, even horrific, terrifying ones like 9/11 occur, and what happens as a consequence of those. All right. So that's it. I hope that this entire semester has been, useful under the strange circumstances of COVID. We've gone through an entire class in U.S. history. I, as always, wish that we'd been able to interact more. I could walk around the class and, we could talk about things and ask questions and so on. So it's unfortunate we didn't have that, but you now have these things on video. You can watch them whenever you want. And hopefully, even more important to me is that you look at them and you think about them. Not that you agree with anything I said or anybody else said, but you look at them and you think about them, think critically, think analytically, question maybe ideas you've had before, and question ideas I've suggested. I hope you understand that it's important to look at a lot of different things before you kind of come to some kind of a decisive idea or conclusion. Facebook memes are not good primary evidence. Some kind of YouTube conspiracy video your friend sent you is not good primary evidence. QAnon theories are not evidence of any kind. Look, think for yourselves. If there's one thing that comes out of this that would be more important than anything else, it would be that idea. Think critically, think for yourselves. Try to look at a bunch of different stuff when you're trying to figure something out. Talk about it. Don't just accept what somebody in authority says to you. All right. I hope that you've enjoyed the semester. I hope you've gotten something out of it. I hope you've been safe. I hope you continue to be safe going forward. Like I said, 20, 30, whoever knows how many years from now, you might be talking to your kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews, or you might be a teacher or a professor, and you'll be discussing 2020. And hopefully some of the things that we've talked about over these 24 lectures will give you a little bit more insight, a little bit more understanding of why 2020 happened. And then in 2040 or 2050, you can look at, what's happened since then and try to figure out how 2020 contributed and evolved out of that. All right. It's been great. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it. I wish I, was in a classroom with you, and, hopefully before too long, we'll be back to some level of, what we were before. I don't know what that'll look like. But in the meantime, stay safe. There's a reason you have books and readings and outlines. Check those out, look at them, try to learn as much as you can. And, as you go forward, remember what Orwell said, right? Whoever controls the past controls the present, and whoever controls the present controls the future. So if you learn about the past, you're in a lot better shape to try to figure out what's happening now and maybe how we can do things differently into the future. All right. Peace out and take care of yourselves.